Good morning, everyone. We are continuing our auditorium class in the book of James. We'll be at the end of James chapter 3 this morning. So we've made quite a bit of progress since the last Sunday of January, I think, is when we started. Right? So. Last week we dealt with the passage that began there in chapter 3. Actually, we had kind of introduced it before because we had dealt with faith without works, and then we kind of had a it's not listed up there. Remember, we kind of had a one class that dealt with the end of chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 3, and we looked at faith and works and words, right? So we had kind of a bridge in there dealing with bridling the tongue, and so we spent our class last week kind of talking about bridling the tongue, but I don't want to lose sight of this idea that he's still talking about talking or speech or teaching. That when we get to this section, that it's not that he's just moved off and he's talking about a totally different subject now. Sometimes, if we're not careful, we can fall into that where we're reading along, or we just jump into James, or it happens with other writers, and we don't pay attention to what's before and what's after. And that can really happen sometimes in James because it's so wisdom-oriented. It's kind of like Proverbs, and where you can dig into a particular point and learn a lot from it. But I don't want us to miss where this is situated within James and why he brings it up here because of what he's getting ready to start talking about. In chapters 4 and 5, he's going to be expanding upon this concept of wisdom that's not from above versus wisdom that is from above, and how that plays out, because the opening part of chapter 4 is going to be, where do wars come from? Well, what did he just talk about at the end of chapter 3? Well, he talked about this wisdom that's not from above that leads to all kinds of disorder and selfish ambition and all sorts of stuff like. So as we get into it, I want us to make sure that we see that. So as we go through our class this morning, it's real kind of simple in the sense that we'll take a minute at the beginning to review kind of what we've already said about wisdom. We'll bring in a couple of other passages that I haven't talked about yet, and then we'll look at how James presents the difference of the wisdom that's not from above versus the wisdom that is from above. So I normally talk about it in terms of wisdom from beneath and wisdom from above, but if you read it, James just uses that there is a wisdom that's not from above, and then there's a wisdom that is from above. And so I'm going to kind of try to use that terminology as we move through this morning. So I'm going to read it. I'm not going to stop, though, at the end of chapter 3. I'm actually going to read into chapter 4, the first 5 verses of chapter 4, so that we don't lose sight. We're going to break the passage apart, but I want us to have some time to see where it fits in. So, beginning there in chapter 3 of verse 1, he introduced the idea that many of you should not become teachers, and he goes on to explain that, but he introduces the idea of how we talk and what our speech says about how wise we are, right? In fact, even Solomon said something to that effect, right? Even a fool who keeps his mouth shut can be seen as wise, right? So sometimes if we don't say anything, people think, oh, wow, look at him. He's just contemplating everything. Well, anyway, so after he does that, he says, right, he talked about the tongue as a, how did he start with it? Where it's right there. Oh, bits in horse's mouth, the rudder of a ship. And then he talked about the fire and the great blaze. Then he says, verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? He's not talking about in general, right? He's not just saying, well, who's the wise? Who's somebody that's wise and understanding? No. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make for peace. What causes quarrels? What causes fights among you? Is it not that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend with the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit he has made to dwell in us? So again, I wanted to not just stop with the wisdom not from above and the wisdom from above without tying it to why he's bringing it in, right? He's talking about them not being at peace. What causes wars? What causes fights or quarrels and arguments, right? Well, because of following a passion or following a wisdom that's not from above. And ultimately, we have to, all of us, ask the question that gets kind of brought to our attention in James chapter 4 at verse 4. Who are we friends with? Right? So that's kind of when we spend our time this morning talking about this wisdom that's not from above versus a wisdom that is from above, don't lose sight of knowing, verse 4 of chapter 4, that friendship with the world is enmity with God. And so this wisdom that's not from above is earthly or worldly wisdom. And so when we use that, who are we talking about or what are we demonstrating as far as our friendship? Who are we friends with when we demonstrate a wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and devilish? So again, it's not that James just decides to start talking about this and just drops it in on us, right? He's got a reason for it. So I want us to keep sight of that. Before we proceed, as we've spent a little time in His Word, let's go to Him in prayer. Our great God and Father, as we approach Your Word again this morning, we thank You so much for the breath and the life that You give us. We thank You so much for the willing hearts that have gathered this morning, the willingness to open Your Word and to delve into the truths that are demonstrated here. Give us the insight and the wisdom, Father, to gain the truths that are contained here in these words. Help us to demonstrate this in the way that we live and approach those who are round about us. Help us to look at the mirror of this word and see the things that are lacking in our own lives and come away with a determination to become the image that you would have us to be in your sight. Be with us and strengthen us in all that we say and do. In Jesus' name we now pray. Amen. In our discussion of wisdom a couple of weeks ago, we brought in several of the passages that are found in the opening chapters of Proverbs. And if you've been following the congregational reading plan the last couple of weeks, that's what you've been doing, right? You've been reading the first couple of chapters of the book of Proverbs. And the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs really aren't kind of like the rest of the book of Proverbs, right? There's a lot of coordinated teaching in those first 9 chapters. And then all of a sudden you kind of get in and after that you get to what you think, what a lot of us think of as Proverbs, these short little statements and things like that. And one of the things that came up in these introductory chapters, these first 9 chapters, is this idea of the fear of the Lord. Right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. In the early portions there, what is that? Chapter 4, something like that. Anyway, and then you move through, and there's a couple of different phrases. And this one that's in chapter 8 is interesting, is that the fear of the Lord is a hatred of evil. Because if you remember, one of the things that we discussed in discussing the introduction to wisdom was we have two times that Solomon's prayer for wisdom is discussed. The one that's in 2 Chronicles just says that he prays for wisdom. But in Kings, in the 1 Kings chapter, I wrote it down, 1 Kings chapter 4 passage, he talks about that he didn't have the insight to go in and out. That meaning that he wasn't mature enough to be able to lead the people, and that he prayed that in leading the people that he would be able to discern between good and evil. And God said, since you prayed for this, I'm going to give you wisdom, right? That you didn't pray for your enemies to be defeated, you didn't pray for yourself to be rich, all of that kind of stuff. No, you prayed for being able to figure out the real difference between good and evil. And that's part of the problem with the wisdom from beneath versus the wisdom from above, right? Is the wisdom from beneath can make us think, right, that good is evil and evil is good. And that's where we kind of run into it. So in chapter 8, if you go back there, there's quite a bit in Proverbs chapter 8. If you read it this week, you're kind of familiar with some of these things. But at I'm not going to read all of it. That's a big chapter, but I'll get there in a minute. Because Proverbs is after Psalms and not before Psalms. So. In chapter 8 begins, does not wisdom call, right? Does not in understanding raise her voice? How did this passage in James chapter 3 verse 13 begin? Who is wise and understanding among you? Right? Well, here in Proverbs chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, it talks about wisdom and understanding, right? Those are some of those synonyms, right? You go back to chapter 1 of Proverbs, and that first 8 or so verses, Solomon has all of those different synonyms for wisdom that's there. Insight, discernment, those kind of different kind of synonyms that he uses. Here he talks about, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? So if we're going to be wise and understanding, we're going to have to go where? Well, James told us in James chapter 1, right? If anyone lacks wisdom, where are you going to go? Ask God, right? Ask God. That's where to go. And so here's this description. And so if you jump down to verse 22, God possessed me at the beginning, right? At the first of his acts of old, age ago I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. Where there were no depths, I was brought forth. Where there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before he had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew the circle on the face of the deep, when he made the firm of the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress its commands, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the children of men, or man. So here's wisdom talking, like wisdom personified, and at the beginning, this is what God does. And part of my thinking in all of this is a phrase I ran into in a set of commentaries that they were produced like back between the 70s and the 80s, maybe back to the 60s. Some of y'all may know them. They're College Press, put out these greenback commentaries. Anyway, the phrase that the guy uses is that children imitate their parents more than they obey their parents. And then when I was looking that up, I ran into this quote. This is by Mark Twain. Well, don't usually have Mark Twain quoted in Bible classes, but children are natural mimics who act like their parents despite every effort to teach them good manners. He's talking about influencing people. Because when we want to be seen as wise and understanding, who wants to be seen as a dumb fool? Right? We don't want to be. Most of us, when he says who is wise and understanding among you, well, that's probably me. I don't know about those other people, right? But I'm probably one of those wise and understanding people. But again, when we think about this part in here, again about teaching and being a teacher, well, when aren't we teaching in some way? Aren't our words and actions, or our lack of words and our lack of actions, demonstrating to other people, teaching in a way? So who is wise and understanding now? That's not a question I can answer for you. I know how James presents it, how we can discern, how we can have insight into this. Those are kind of, again, those wisdom kind of thing, right? Who is wise and understanding now? How do we know, right? By his good conduct, let him show his works. That's ultimately how James brings this all down. So again, he's not trying to tell us that we're earning something. He's asking us to look in the mirror, right? Isn't that what he brought up before? That somebody that looks into what God has to say and sees what God says, this is what you look like. And now, am I going to, or am I going to pick it up and say, oh, I'm lacking. I'm not demonstrating ultimately my love. Because if I love God with all my heart, mind, and soul strength, I'm going to keep His commandments. If you love me, keep my commandments. And then James just brought it up, and he called it what in chapter 2? He called it the royal law, and then he called it the law of liberty, right? And what was that law? Love your neighbor as yourself. So how are we going to do that? Are we just going to say, oh, peace be filled? Or are we going to reach out, do something, right? Demonstrate, show. So I got this other question. What's the meekness of wisdom? Or wisdom's meekness? So what's meek? Submitting. Humbleness. Self-control. Definitely tied up in meekness. Do any of y'all know Aristotle? Again, not somebody we always talk about in Bible class. He described it as strength under control. So it's interesting with James's use of the bit in horses' mouths earlier. That was one of Aristotle's or examples of meekness. You have this, right? The ones anywhere from 1,000 pounds up, and this little bitty piece of metal in their mouth, and all of that strength of that horse is under the rider's control. So it was strength under control. When I was in college, I worked with a bunch of horse people, and so they talked about breaking horses, but they also talked about gentling horses, right? And gentling horses it wasn't just that they could take a bit, but they could use that bit in very fancy ways. Now, we had riders there that were show riders that didn't use bits, right? They did like the Andalusian type stuff. Now, they were doing Arabians, but they did it all with their knees, right? They just did pressure by their knees to move those horses around. They had a bridle on them, but they had no bit in their mouths. Yes?
I was thinking more like bulls instead of horses.
Okay.
There's those kind of people that are sort of like bulls. They just run up and down and butt things and knock them over and toss them up with their horns. And they want everybody to see how strong they are and how important they are, and they've got to run over people and trample them. That is not being meek.
That's true.
You can have a bull that just sits there and does a job and nobody's scared of him, and those are the kinds you want. The others get turned into hamburgers.
That's a good example. So, right? So the part of it that went with it, right? It's bitter envy and selfish ambition. That does sound like it was an interesting thing. I don't know if any of y'all ever watched the Mythbusters. It's an old show that was on. They did a China in a bull shop. I mean, a bull in a China in a bull shop. A bull in a China shop, and it didn't knock anything over. It went through the aisles. It didn't want to knock the aisles over. It was very interesting. I just thought it was fascinating. But anyway, so bitter envy and selfish ambition. That word there, right, that it can either be translated envy or jealousy because of it tied in both concepts. Although there was another word that was used more for envy than this word was, right? But this one contained both ideas. But he doesn't talk about it as just jealousy or just envy. He puts this other word with it, that it's bitter. Because the word itself could be used in a good way, right? So he wants to make sure that they don't get any idea that this is used in a good way. The way that it was used in a good way is if you saw somebody that had something that you wanted to have, and it motivated you to do what was necessary so that you could have it also, not instead of, right? That's usually where envy plays with us. Somebody has something and we want it so that they can't have it, right? Where this was a word that could say, like, that guy's really smart. I wish I was that smart. And so this could provoke me to want to go out and become smart. But the other thing that this could do is that guy's got a gold cup. I want that gold cup. I'm going to go take that gold cup from him. So I have his gold cup and he doesn't. Right? So that's the other side of this. So, and again, I point this out. Why is this passage following the passage on teaching in the tongue? How many teachers do you want to spend a lot of time with that are filled with bitter envy and selfish ambition? Kind of sounds the opposite of somebody that's wise and understanding, right? Yes?
I was reading about a tribe. I'm not going to say where it is. I mean, it's just supposed to be typical of these kind of people. If one of the kids got a bicycle and the other kids didn't have a bicycle, the ones that didn't would break the other one's bicycle so that he didn't have one either. That way none of them had the same thing.
Yeah, okay. Can be that way in life. Other thoughts on that part? This do not boast, or how is this a denial of the truth or against, right? Denying the truth, or can also be kind of being false to the truth, right? Denying the truth. Because the other question I have up there, is it wrong to be ambitious, right?
Well, we should want people not to have things. I mean, envy means that you don't want them to have it and you want what they have. Shouldn't we want everybody to have good things?
Well, that's kind of part of it, but again, it's so we should be ambitious, right? But what are we ambitious for, I guess, is the question. Right? I come back to the difference between, I always call him the rich young ruler, right? But again, that's not ever said you have to put the three accounts together to get the fact that he's a rich young ruler. Versus Zacchaeus. The rich young ruler went away sorrowful. But he didn't think what was his question? What do I still lack? Right? Good teacher, what must I do that I may inherit eternal life? And Jesus goes through, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness. All these I have done, or honor your father and your mother. All of these I have kept from my youth up. What then do I still lack? Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor and come follow me. And you will have great rewards in heaven. And he went away sorrowful because he had great riches. Right? Now, Jesus never tells Zacchaeus, sell everything that you have and come follow me. Because Zacchaeus didn't come to Jesus and say, what do I still lack? In fact, when Jesus invited him, says, I'm going to come into your house, and in the midst of the feast, Zacchaeus says, you know what? If I've done wrong, I'm going to repay however many fold, I forget how many fold he says. I'm going to take care of all. He doesn't sound like he has a problem with his wealth, right? If Jesus had said to Zacchaeus, go and sell all that you have and and give it to the poor and come follow me, what do you think Zacchaeus would have said? Okay, let's get going, right? So it's just the opposite attitude of bitter envy and selfish ambition. To me, those are kind of the illustrations, right? You have on the one hand somebody who was interested, and yet when the Word of God showed him what he looked like, he turned away and didn't want to have anything to do with it. And yet Zacchaeus was so eager, he was coming up with ways to do things. Yes? Mm.
We boast that we got the position and they did not get it. And if we had to go about it in a way that was not totally legitimate, we boast about that. So you see how screwed I am? I did this. You would be boasting about what you got from your ambition. Or jealousy. You're wanting a position, doesn't have to be a position, you want an item, whatever. You go about it and you get it, and then you boast about how you did it.
Mm-hmm.
So you're boasting about that sin. Or on the other hand, you may not want to admit it.
Yeah.
I got this position, I didn't deserve it, I know I didn't, but you don't ever say anything about that. So for that, you're denying the truth of what you did. So I think that's what he's saying. It's a bad situation. It's not good, really, for most people to even have envy or jealousy. God is jealous of his people because he doesn't want them to be lost.
Right.
Paul was jealous about his converts because he didn't want them to be lost. It wasn't that, oh, I converted this person, now look, that looks bad on me.
Yeah.
So there's a jealousy that's okay, that's right, to be jealous for the truth. But for the most part, envy of any type or selfish ambition always is going to be wrong. And then you can handle it, you can either admit it and be sorry for it, which would be the humility and meekness, or you can ignore it because you don't want other people to know it, or you can go to the other extreme and brag about it.
Yeah.
I think that's what he's saying here. Either way you handle it, if you don't do it submitting, I was wrong, I had no right to act or think that way, which would be the humility. If I don't do it with humility, I'm either going to brag about it or I'm going to act like it didn't happen, I'm going to deny it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to the, oops, I went too far, didn't I? Whoops, what am I? Oh yeah, there we go, I got it. So again, I'm using the NIV here because the words, right, earthly, unspiritual, or devilish, of the devil. So again, he brings this back up. He doesn't say bitter envy this time, but he uses it again. So where you have envy and bitter or where you have envy and selfish ambition, and that again, that's really not two words. That's just one word, but it's one of those Greek words that's shoved up together, and so you kind of we have to break it apart to understand it. Yeah, you had something?
Yeah, that's something about boasting. But, sometimes I think boasting is associated with pride.
Yes. Yeah, if I'm wanting people to see me, how good I look, right? That's the boasting part. But we can do, what's the, there's a technical, shouldn't say a technical term, there's a modern term for somebody that kind of downplays their accomplishments because they want you to boast for them. Have you ever, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? Somebody kind of does the aw shucks thing, so that you'll compliment them more, you'll boast about them more, and anyway, I don't know, there's like a term for that. But anyway, so it's that word unspiritual there, that's not a word that we can just easily translate into English. When I think of this one, and you'll have to help me out on this one, but the example that I think of this one is like Esau. Right? Esau was only focused on what he felt, and as a result of what he felt, what he wanted right now. Long-term consequences, something that's not going to happen for, decades down the road, this birthright stuff, whatever, right? I want something to eat now. So that's kind of that earthly, unspiritual idea. To me, that just seemed like the example that kind of stands out. Is his focus was on the earthly, on the not the spiritual side of the issue. The word there is soulish, but we can get the wrong idea from that. But it's just that focus on the earthly comfort. And then he talks about it as being demonic or from the devil. And if you tie that back up to denying the truth, right? Because that's kind of the whole thing Satan starts with, right? Is he's a father of lies and he's a liar from the beginning. Yes, Jeff?
I think you're fishing for instant gratification.
Yeah, okay. There's the other term that goes with it.
King James says sensual for that.
Sensual, yeah. The stuff that appeals to the flesh, right? Yes, sorry.
I think another word we might try to use is rivalry.
Okay, that's a,
That we all seem to compete against each other all the time. This sister was saying over here that, I got a position and you didn't. And we're all rivals for the same position. That leads to envy. Rivalry is part of ambition.
and you do kind of end up with disorder and evil practices when people think that way. That you know,
Not always pulling for each other, pulling in the same direction.
you're more pulling for yourself, and if I run over you while I'm pulling for myself, then you should have got out of my way. It's your fault that I ran into you because you should have got out of my way. And that's something that I have to remind myself of, is most people aren't against me. They're just really for themselves. And I just happen to get in their way. So when people, right, they're not planning their day on how to get Patrick. They're planning their day on themselves, and poor little Patrick gets in their way and I get run over, right? But it's not because I'm going to get him, even though it feels like that to me sometimes. They were out to get me. But no, they weren't really out to get me. They were just out for themselves, and I got in the way. So that just kind of, it may not be true. But so the fruits that result from this is the stuff that everybody loves, right? Disorder and every evil practice, right? That sounds like a family reunion for some people, but we don't want that. And my kids heard this constantly growing up. Don't feed the drama, right? For lack of wood, what happens? There's no fire. The fire goes out. For lack of wood, the fire goes out. I think that's in the book of Proverbs, isn't it? Right? Yeah, it is. It's right there. So, right? if we want to get rid of disorder and every evil practice, it sounds like what we need to do is we need to get rid of the wisdom that doesn't come down from heaven. So, what characterizes the wisdom from above? So it starts with pure. What's the other word that can be translated there? Does anybody know? We translate that word a bunch of different ways, depending on where it's used in a sentence, what part of speech it is. It's the same word as holy. It's also the same word as saint, right? The same word as sanctified, right? All of those words come from this Greek root, right? And so what's something that's pure?
Are you asking about something?
Just anything. What is something that, when you say something is pure, it's unspotted.
It's one thing, it's not mixed.
It's not mixed. Clean. What is ivory?
99.9% pure.
Okay, so that means that there's something else in it, right? Besides just, there's not a lot, but there is a little, right? So it's first pure, and then he talks about it being peaceable, gentle, open to reason. Now, again, I keep coming back to teaching, but not just teaching, influencing others, right? If we're going to be influential, if we're going to be people that maybe not just seen as super wise and understanding, but at least somebody that's not a dumb fool, right? How does that peaceable, gentle, open to reason play into that, right? Think about it in terms of teachers. Think about it in terms of people that you're willing to go to when there's difficulties and you want advice, when you want to seek counsel, wise counsel, you're looking to understand better, right? Those kind of things. People that are peaceable, gentle, and open to reason are people that you seek out for those kind of things, right? Now, this whole idea of peaceable, I don't know if you've noticed how much that's come up. It goes all the way, to me, it goes all the way back to chapter 2 when he talks about the royal law. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because that's where peaceability kind of begins to start. Because if I don't love my neighbor as myself, I'm going to end up with selfish ambition and envy, and that's going to lead to what? All sorts of disorder and evil practices. So I come back to this. Now that gentle there is the idea of gentle. Sometimes we translate the word meek, and then sometimes that word gets translated as gentle other places. Well, this is the Greek word for gentle, not the Greek word for meek. That may have been confusing. But you think about that in terms of dealing with other people. How gentle was Jesus in dealing with the woman caught in adultery? So we can find, and you don't have to just do that, you can look at those examples that we have of that. That idea of being open to reason, that's that. Other translate that as easily entreated, right? That's that, again, interpersonal stuff, that willingness to listen. You know, when we talked about being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, I know that was weeks ago that we discussed that. And the primary responsibility is to listen to what God has to say, and don't speak back to God, right? Don't become wrathful about the way God handles the situations of life. But the secondary part of that is, right, we're willing to listen to the other side of the story, right? We're willing to listen to what other people have to say. And the value that comes from that, right, is this harvest of righteousness. And he talks about it again as it's sown in peace by those who make for peace. That I don't know, I just kind of, again, towards the end here, focusing on this. If you turn to Matthew chapter 5, you may have already thought of it. And in the opening of what we refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, right? He talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit, verse 3, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Then verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for they shall inherit, or for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Then he goes on, right? Those blessed are those when you are reviled and persecuted and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then he says what? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Well, how are we going to be salt and light? Well, it's going to be when we are poor in spirit, mournful. I understand that with really recognition of sinfulness, right? When we're meek, when we get our will under the control of God's will, not my will, but thine be done. Meekness, divine meekness. Jesus in the garden, not my will, but thine be done. Right? So there's meekness. And so we end up with this harvest of right relationships, right? Righteousness, right wayness. Righteousness is the idea that everything's the right way. That means my relationship with God is in the right situation that my relationship with God should be. And so that necessitates me having the right relationship I should have with my neighbor. Because if I'm not in the right relationship with my neighbor, how can I be in a right relationship with God? And if I'm in a right relationship with God, that necessitates me being in a right relationship with my neighbor. And so we have this peace, right? That making peace ought to come from a place of peace. When we know that we've been made at peace with God because of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done and our devotion to Him and our ultimate demonstration of that, right? So, just to kind of take away and think about, in Matthew the 25th chapter, after, I'm not going to get into a big discussion of Matthew the 24th chapter. I don't divide Matthew 24. Anyway, Matthew 25 begins with, then the kingdom of heaven will be like. Okay, so he's now talking about, sounds like Christians, because we have virgins, some are wise and some are foolish. But in that particular parable, they all fall asleep. The condemnation isn't that they fell asleep. Right? There's a lot in the Gospel of Matthew staying awake. But after 24, we have some virgins that fall asleep. But some were prepared because of what? What they had done in their lives, right, was the oil that they had to equip their lamps. But they had done it while they had garnered the fruits now. Anyway, next week we'll pick up in chapter 4. Thanks again, everybody. Appreciate it.
You know what? I forgot my key. I forgot my key.